and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, you have part 6, the next to last video in my SCASL project, and the last video in which I will be talking about books that I read and giving reviews of them. This is the final part of the Junior Book Awards. We'll start off with Cleo Porter and the Body Electric. I realized later on that I have read another book by Jake Burt before as part of the SCASL project, but I enjoyed it. I thought his writing was decent. I enjoyed his narrative voice, and once I realized that he was the same author of both of those, I'm like, okay, I see that, and it made sense for why I enjoyed Cleo Porter the way that I did. Cleo Porter and the Body Electric is one of those books that has the fortunate or unfortunate timing of being pandemic related and coming out around the time of the pandemic. Now, Jake Burt, this book was published in 2020. So Jake Burt obviously was writing this prior to the outbreak of COVID. He was doing some final edits when lockdowns were going on, and he mentions in his author notes that he made a few changes based on that. Now, what has happened is there was this major pandemic. They called it Influenza D, like Delta, for changing a lot, that was massively terrible. It caused all sorts of harm to the people. And their ultimate solution was to build these basically pods that were entirely self-contained. Like the people inside the pods never went outside. Like the doors weren't even doors. You never interacted in person with anyone except for your family. And everything was run by drones. And so that's the world that Cleo knows as real. The beginning of the book sets up with, there's a package that had their home address on it. I think it's just a number, but it was the wrong person. And it was medicine that if a person needed that medicine, they would die without. And so Cleo has to face the issue of what does she do about this? How does she get this medicine to this person so that they don't die? Because she's training to become a doctor. And how they do like medicine in those days, the practice of medicine, her mother's a surgeon, they have drones and like VR controls and etc. But she's studying to become a doctor. And so she knows what would happen. And so the book is basically her quest, her attempt to get this medicine to the woman whose name is on the package. And in so doing, she discovers a lot about her world that she wasn't expecting. And she meets some unexpected characters as well. One thing I really appreciated about what Jake Burt did with this is he didn't turn it into this, she discovers that her life is not what it seems, and so there's something evil and nefarious and she has to take down the system. It's typically what happens with these types of books. That doesn't happen in this book, and I really appreciated this because it allowed for room for real character growth, real character exploration that Cleo hasn't quite reached by the end of the book, but she's headed in that direction. And I really appreciated that. So I rated this 4 stars. As far as representation goes, I didn't really see anything. It was very odd because it was in a dystopian sort of world and you didn't interact with that many characters. I believe there was disability representation with one of the characters that you don't meet until the very end, but I can't remember. As far as quality and or teaching potential, I would not use it as a whole class novel. I think there's a lot of quality to it, but not necessarily the quality that I would use for, say, teaching material. As far as keeping on classroom shelves, it's short, it's got a nice condensed plot, and I would definitely keep it on the classroom shelves. One thing I didn't mention in my review is the thing that brought it down a little bit for me is the fact that, judging based on how everyone responded to lockdown in 2020, I don't think that an entire society would willingly subject their lives to live in a confined area without any relief. I just don't think it would happen. That's where I come in with the idea that this had the unfortunate timing of being released around those same times. Putting that aside, as I mentioned in the previous 3 parts, I will talk about the rankings at the end of this video. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Dress Coded by Carrie Firestone. as a former middle school teacher who had to deal with all kinds of issues with dress code and students talking about it, also with someone whose own educational experience had to deal with a ridiculous dress code, and also as a woman who deals with the real facts that most dress codes are entirely sexist. I resonated with this book. I thought it was really well done. It brings in a little bit of podcasting aspects. The main character is really ticked off at something that happens to a friend of hers, and how this friend is basically shamed because she, quote unquote, violated dress code because she got her period and had to have her sweatshirt off and wrapped around her pants and was trying to get a new pair of pants. And the principal used it as an excuse for the class to not go on the class field trip. And so the book chronicles this girl's growing fight to get the dress code changed. Done away with is how she thinks about it, but in so doing, she talks about a lot of the different issues with the dress code and the effects that it has had on different people and how much it is targeted towards women. So I thought it was really good. There were a few things that this former teacher is like, that's not really how schools work. But I think you're gonna have that regardless in these sorts of books, just because not every author can be a former teacher. So I thought it was really well done. I'm pretty sure I rated this a low 4 stars, maybe a high 3.5 stars. Again, I forgot to write down those notes. As far as representation goes, there's a lot of representation in here. There's LGBT+, there is plus size rep, there are a few different ethnicity, Latinx, I believe. Really well done on that front. As far as quality and or teaching potential, I don't know necessarily that I would use it as a whole class novel or a book club book. I might, if I were doing a themed book club like I have done in the past. I've done a civil rights era book club that was really focused on the time period. And if I were wanting to branch out and bring in another example of ways that people are fighting for social justice, I might put that in there because it's a very realistic, applicable use of that idea. As far as keeping it on the classroom shelves, 100% would have this on classroom shelves. Next we have Santiago's Road Home by Alexandra Diaz. I have now read 2 more Alexandra Diaz books since reading The Only Road a couple years ago and wholeheartedly adoring it. And both of them have fallen short of my memory of that experience. Neither of the books that I have read this year, the sequel to The Only Road, as well as Santiago's Road Home, neither of them are bad books. They just are missing that quality that I found in that other book, and I'm not sure why. In this book, Santiago is basically on his own. He never knew his father. His mother has died. He lives with relatives who are flat out abusive, and he has this opportunity where instead of going back to his terrible grandmother, he meets a woman who's, let's say, 4 to 6 years older than him. So she's very late teens, early 20s. And she is leaving an abusive marriage with her daughter, and she is trying to get to the United States. And she's a very kind, compassionate woman who sort of adopts Santiago as her brother. And they go together, they are becoming family in this journey across the border. Obviously it's not easy, but in contrast to The Only Road, the real conflict or problem that Alexandra Diaz is shining a light on in this book is the family separation policy of the previous administration. Because both of the daughter and Santiago get separated from, I believe her name's Mariana, but I can't remember. I think that Alexandra Diaz did a pretty good job in highlighting just how the reality of this situation and what it does. It just lacked a certain something for me, partially because Santiago was not really separated from his mother. That was a woman who he called his sister, who he made a really good connection to it, but he was not actually separated from family. And secondly, the way things wrapped up just put a nice neat bow on things. And so many of those stories of real life situations that happened had no sort of nice pretty bow. It just fell short of what I expected from it. Not bad, just disappointing. And so I believe I rated it 3.5 stars. As far as representation goes, you have Latinx, obviously. I believe they're all Mexican. As far as quality and or teaching potential, I think if I wanted to say do a book club where it showed immigrant stories or gave perspectives of different ethnicities, I might use it as part of that. I think that this is definitely one that could be taught from. I'm not sure necessarily that I would, however, simply because of how everything sorts out. I think there are things to be said about older books such as Lupita Mañana, which I have used to teach from quite successfully, that this book just misses. As far as keeping it on the classroom shelves, I would definitely keep it on the shelves. More diversity is needed on classroom shelves, hands down. Next, we have the standout of this group, and that is Fighting Words. I knew after seeing the author that I would hands down love this book. I gave 5 stars to the previous 2 books that I have read from her. One I read a couple years ago, and the second I read a month or so ago as part of completing series. The War That Saved My Life and The War I Finally Won. In this book, you have 2 sisters who grew up in a pretty terrible situation. Their mom struggled with addiction. They were with a person after her mother was incarcerated who was not related to them at all. He was their mother's current boyfriend at the time she was incarcerated, and he just claimed to be their father. Like, he didn't actually come out and say anything. The system just let him take the girls. And there's about, I'd say, a 5-year gap between her and her older sister. And the reason that they are now free from this man is because of something that he did to the main character that the older sister caught on camera, because he came home early. He's like a long haul trucker or something. It turns out that he had been not great, I'll just say that as a euphemism, to the older sister even before the mother was incarcerated. And the older sister is dealing with years of trauma that lead her to a point where she does attempt to unalive herself. But the way that the foster mother, the way that everyone comes together to handle it is so beautiful. It's realistic, but it's beautiful. And she ends up having to stay in inpatient facility to get help. And at the same time, the younger sister is having to deal with these new situations, being out of a really messed up world that for all of her life, she thought was the world. She thought that was how the world worked. And when different things would happen, like with the foster mother and with people at school, she would be baffled because you're like, wait, it works like that? What? People are like this? This is really deep and really important. Just so well done. I rated this 4.5 stars. As far as representation goes, there is really solid mental health representation and dealing with PTSD and things like that. As far as teaching potential, quality and teaching potential, it is high quality. Due to the traumatic subject and a lot of the things talked about in this book, I don't know necessarily that I would use it either as whole class or book club, just because there are a lot of things that could be triggers for students. In some ways, it might be helpful. They might speak up. They might come say something. But I never want to do something. I would never want to use something that would be a trigger that would further the harm. I would keep this on my classroom shelves with content warnings in the book. I think it definitely needs to be talked about and read. But again, you have to be really careful with a lot of the things that were talked about in this book. The last book that I read as part of this project was The Stitchers. I didn't think that I would necessarily like this book. It was compared to Goosebumps, and in the Scholastic catalogs that I got as a kid, those were books that I'm like, no, I don't do horror. And this was compared to Goosebumps. Now, Goosebumps is horror, not really horror. But that was never me. As a child, as an adult, no. This book never got there. It just never did. It felt very, the There's a little bit of a mystery, a little bit of creepy neighbors, but it was so childish and pedantic. In that way, I guess you could compare it to Goosebumps. Now, I've actually never read a Goosebumps, but I've watched How to Train Your Gavin's 2 different feature-length vlogs where he read through all these different Goosebumps books, and I just think very similar to that. The characters were fine. There was decent interactions. I think the plot felt fine. The adults in the story really felt like Charlie Brown characters, except for one of the adults. I mean, you're going to get that in this sort of a book. It just was average. Now, I just finished reading that this morning, so I haven't run it through Cawpile, but it's probably a low 3 stars. As far as representation goes, I didn't notice any, unfortunately. As far as quality and teaching potential, as you can surmise from my little review there, no. It is not high quality. That's not a knock on it. It's just not like highly literary. Teaching potential, I would not use this to teach from. They're just books that you are meant to enjoy, and you don't have to use as case studies. As far as keeping it on classroom shelves, yeah, I would keep it on the shelves. Horror is incredibly popular. My students, when I talk to them, they love horror. And I'm like, wait, I had 7th graders reading It by Stephen King. Multiple 7th graders reading it. So horror is pretty popular. Should they be reading it? That's another story. Now we get to the rankings. We did have some shifts at the top. Some shifts were amongst books that I've already reviewed, but I have thought about my rankings a little bit more because these are my final rankings, and some shifts because of the books that I read in this section. So still tied at top, you have The Shape of Thunder and you have Starfish. They're brilliant. I didn't think that either of them could get knocked down from there, and I was right. Next you have Amari and the Night Brothers. This is one that I switched with another book. After doing my reread and seeing so much more nuances, Amari had to get bumped up to 3rd. Had to get bumped up to 3rd. In 4th, you have Fighting Words. I just think that it just was such a powerful, well done book. It has to be up there. I might actually tie it with Amari, or very, very close. They're just such different books, and they're excellent for very different reasons. At number 5, you have Closer to Nowhere, which used to be number 3. At number 6, you have The In-Between. At number 7, you have Tune It Out. At number 8, you have Ground Zero. At number 9, you have Cleo Porter and the Body Electric. At number 10, you have Twins. At number 11, you have Dress Coded. At number 12, you have The Canyon's Edge. And at number 13, you have Alone. At number 14, you have Santiago's Road Home. At number 15, you have The Stitchers. At number 16, you have City Spies. At number 17, you have Measuring Up. I've just decided to make a change. So at number 18, you have All He Knew. At number 19, you have Turtle Boy. And at number 20, probably the worst and the most disappointing book to be selected for this, you have The Brave by James Bird. Probably the most disappointing out of all 40 books I reviewed for this project. It does have the lowest rating out of all 40 books. So there you have my top 20, my 20 books ranked for the Junior Book Awards. In the next and last part of this project, you have my overall thoughts on the project, things that went well, things that maybe I'll improve for next time, and which books I think will actually win. And we'll see if I'm right. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.